This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me when I'm telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Well, since there wasn't a Monday show this week, I actually went ahead and got a jump start with the recording for the Friday show. Figured, well, hypothetically, I could have recorded on Monday after I get home from work and I'm tired, exhausted, and not really in the mood. Or I could just do it on Sunday morning since I have some free time. Get the process going. So here we are. And I'm actually glad I decided to do this on Sunday because I have a lot of notes for this week's episode of WCW. I don't know why. A lot of it was my note-taking for stuff that happened during that Rick Steiner-Robin Green segment, which was... well, we'll get into it. It was quite the experience. But yeah. Welcome everybody to the pre-recorded FSWR Friday show. We are the wrestling podcast nobody knows but everybody needs. Here on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays. Except for the Mondays when there's nothing to review because WWF is preempted by other programming. See, I just assumed that because next week's Raw was pre-taped for the following Friday because of Labor Day, I thought they would have at least aired an episode the week prior. I always forget that, though. Yeah, there was a time frame back in the mid-90s where the WWF just kind of took a couple weeks off after SummerSlam. So that's why you didn't get a Monday show this week, in case people were worried. I know I false advertised that. But we do have a lot to get into with this Friday episode. So let's do our usual thing and talk about some classic wrestling. Our favorite pastime. So we're back up and running with WCW. I just need to start double checking weekly to make sure there's actually an episode to talk about. Done such a bad habit of just presuming there's going to be a weekly TBS show to review. I never take into account when they actually don't air an episode. Then I look like the jackass when I say, oh yeah, normal Friday podcast. WCW, Midsouth, and World Class. Well, shit. Turns out there's no episode of WCW this week. But no, we did have one this week. And boy, howdy was it a show. It was... you know, what can I say at this point? It was WCW programming in 1989. There was some stuff that aired. A lot of it was hot garbage. The main event was fantastic. But by the time we got to the hour mark, I asked the same question I asked 2 weeks ago. Can someone logically explain to me why this episode needed to be 2 hours? Here's the thing, too. I believe this week was also a 2-hour program. But because I'm watching all these shows on YouTube now, since Peacock just stopped uploading the WCW library at some point in 1989, I think the runtime on the YouTube feed for this show was like an hour and 6 minutes. Maybe a little more than that. But there was still plenty of content that was scrapped from the original tape. Whoever recorded this thing skipped over a lot of content. I mean, most of it was commercial break, but I don't know, it just seemed like there was still a lot missing. The ironic part is, even with them cutting shit from the 2-hour taping block, I was still on the verge of tears by the time it was over, asking myself, when will it be over? And Dusty was in my ear the whole time saying, it will never be over. The show began partway through a Dick Slater Gary Hart promo, which they aired in full later on. This is just a teaser. I like my opening statement here, though. It was just sarcastic enough to even humor myself. Oh, check that out. Dick Slater is now just randomly affiliated with Gary Hart. No explanation. And well, it was kind of explained later on how Slater became part of Gary's faction, which we now know is called the J-Tex Corporation. I'll elaborate more on that later. It kind of follows a pattern of a lot of stuff happening in WCW around this time. Random people showing up unannounced. Others disappear for weeks at a time with no explanation. You know, it's funny because if you were to ask me to name like 10 guys on the active NWA roster in, say, 1986, I could do that no problem. In fact, I could probably rattle off at least half the roster easily. I would actually have to think about 10 guys who were active throughout the entirety of 1989 in the NWA. Like, if you told me, hey, remember when Dick Slater showed up in 1989? I'd be like, well, I know he was there. If you asked me to name the time frame, I probably couldn't do it without looking it up. Anyway, I'm already getting lost in the sauce here. We got way too much to talk about, so let's try to stay on track. We open with Keith Steinborn and John Brewer versus the Midnight Express. First thing I noted here is how continually awful Keith Steinborn's haircut seems to get. He used to wrestle with his hair completely down. Now it's gone to the point where he's just braiding it back in a ponytail, but he still has that goofy mullet in the front, which isn't even really a mullet. He just doesn't even have layers. He also fucking sucks, but nothing new to report on there. There was a spot that I watched back like 3 times. I couldn't stop laughing. Bobby Eaton goes to give him a swinging neck breaker, and Keith fucked it up so badly, Bobby just let go and watched Keith take a flat bump. And then he threw his arms up like, Jesus H. Christ. Yeah, brother, that right there is when you know you just need to hang up the boots. Call it a career. When beautiful Bobby can't get something out of you, you're done. So the Midnights took some turns doing babyface spots until they pinned Brewer with a Vegematic. Stan had his hand taped up from a previous injury, which may have been legit. I don't know. He was still using the hand, so it must not have been that severe. You know, again, I talk about it all the time. My favorite tag team in the world, and God, watching them in 1989 is like watching the latter years of your dog as he's limping through the living room on his hind legs. You're like, yeah, they're still around, but boy, are their best years behind them. At least from a booking standpoint. And the babyface sympathy the Midnights were getting in 1989 was literally that. It was sympathy from the fans because everybody knew how poorly mistreated these guys were. The greatest tag team in the world at the time, and they were just floundering. At least they got some promo time this week. Cornette actually got a lot of promo time. He was just a random color commentator with JR, which I'm not complaining about. But, yeah, he just kind of came out to do commentary and never left. So, oh yeah, they also aired a quick highlight package of the Skyscrapers. And by that I mean it was basically a Psycho Sid highlight package with some Dan Spivey stuff sprinkled in there occasionally. Because, you know, it was kind of hard to find any highlight clips of Dan Spivey's work. But yeah, Cornette did the usual great hype promo for his men. Talked about the Midnight's credentials, 2-time World Tag Team Champions, 2-time Tag Team of the Year, etc. They've beaten all the best wrestling's had to offer, and they'll continue to beat anybody that's thrown in their way. He plugged an upcoming match with the Freebirds in the Omni for the following night, which I believe was just a captain's match with Bobby Eaton and Jimmy Garvin. And then right as Corny was really starting to get going, JR had to cut him off for the commercial pitch. And he had a great closing line where JR went to shake hands with Bobby Eaton, and he goes, "Thanks, Bob. That Bob, he talks way too much." Right. Because if there's one thing we all know about beautiful Bobby, that guy would never shut up whenever he had a mic in front of him. Then we had Trent Knight and Mike Justice versus the Skyscrapers. Polar opposite of the previous tag match we just saw. Listening to poor Jim Cornette have to try to put these guys over here, you can tell he was gritting his teeth the entire time. God love the man. He was a true professional. With a straight face on nationwide television, talking about how imposing and dominant Dan Spivey is. Now, Sid, I can buy. Because you take one look at that freak of nature, you believe that guy is one dangerous motherfucker. Even Cornette's had a few good things to say about Sid during his time. You watch 20 seconds of a Dan Spivey match, you know that guy couldn't whip cream with an outboard motor. What a geek. So they're out there having this long, boring match. Cornette's doing his best to try to give the Skyscraper some credibility, but it is so forced. The Midnight Skyscrapers feud is easily one of the worst programs Bobby and Stan ever had to work in their careers. Right up there with the Dynamic Dudes. They couldn't get shit out of those matches no matter how hard they tried. So they're obviously trying to set the stages for that. Meanwhile, Spivey and Sid end up getting themselves disqualified after beating up Trent Knight in the corner for like 5 minutes straight. It wasn't actually 5 minutes, but boy, it seemed like it. I am So not looking forward to having to review those matches. I'm actually dreading it more than having to review the matches with the dudes, because at least that feud had some twists and turns in it. The skyscraper feud was just painfully dull and uninteresting. Plus the matches stunk to high heaven. So then we had like the greatest thing ever. Aside from the main event, it actually wound up being one of my favorite parts of the show. And it had next to nothing to do with anything story related. For some reason, they decided to book a segment where JR and Jim Cornette read some hate mail from a bunch of angry women who apparently got sideways with JR over some snide comments he made about Lex Luger. And these women were, dare I say, hostile toward Jim Ross. So, well, this is actually a thing. They read a letter on air from a disgruntled fan of Luger's, basically calling JR a pea-head and a limp dick because he was demeaning Luger on television. And I had a fun time with it because I got to hear JR be witty and fire back at a bunch of dumb bimbos. I don't actually know if this was legit mail. I can't imagine a world where they would work something like this. Granted, the image was blurry, so you couldn't really see the return address on the envelope. I kind of want to think this is actual hate mail that some random girl sent to the office. Doesn't seem that out of the ordinary. Especially considering all of Cornette's stories about the hate mail he received when the Midnights beat up the Rock and Roll Express on television. He still has collections of mail that he got from angry, bitter women. And it never gets old hearing him read those comments. I just wish JR's retort comments were as good as his dating advice to Rick Steiner. Air quotes around the words, dating advice. So yeah, I guess we got to talk about this now. This was WCW sports entertainment for the next 2 or 3 minutes. Everything that WCW tried so hard not to be under the Crockett regime, which was WWF Light. Well, they opened that forbidden door. So Rick's got a date with Robin Green, his #1 fan. We've seen Robin show up for all of Rick's matches and segments. She's the nerdy gal next door who's just madly in love with Rick. Head over heels. Genuine burning desire, the whole 9 yards. And, well, as we all know when it comes to Rick, he's not the sharpest knife in the kitchen drawer, if you know what I'm saying. So he's hanging out with JR and he's feeding him pointers, trying to get Rick ready for his big date. And of course, JR is thinking about all the traditional courting things that men used to do when setting up the date with a woman. He's thinking fancy dinner, mood lighting, flowers, dressy attire, perhaps some champagne. Not Rick, though. Rick's not about that life. He's a Leave It to Beaver watching, pizza eating, casual dater. In other words, he's just looking to hook up and get her done, so to speak. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but well, I'm not going to get into the weeds with that. So, well, here's where they completely lost the plot. He's supposed to meet Robin in her hotel room. Keep in mind, according to Rick Steiner, he is supposed to pay for the hotel room that Robin is staying in. So they have a date set up, and the assumption is that Rick is going to meet Robin at a hotel room to, I guess, have said date. But in order for Rick to actually gain access to the suite, to even see Robin, he has to pay for it. Now, at that point, any rational, sane man is looking at that and saying, oh, hell fucking no. That would have been my cue to dip out. No thanks, sweetheart. The shaboinkin' ain't that good. Can you imagine a woman saying that to somebody? A guy with actual standards? Sure, you can fuck me, but you have to pay for my hotel room first to even gain access. So, yeah, Rick Steiner apparently has not read The Rational Male by Rollo Tomasi. Not that he could at the time, because Rollo's first book didn't even come out until 2013 when it was published. Point is, Rick is obviously not in control of this relationship dynamic. And so, well, it gets even more quirky. First off, he brings JR up to the suite with him, which is a terrible idea on paper. And poor Rick is too afraid to even knock on the door, he's so intimidated. So JR does all the work. He knocks. The door opens. We get... telling you, dude, if GIFs were a thing in the late 80s, this JR Rick Steiner camera shot would have been gold. The hit of the decade. Now, what are they spellbound by, mind you? Well, remember how everything we've seen of Robin Green is her in the old school nerdy geek outfit? Yeah, she became Nancy here. She was in the long, black, skin-tight outfit. One might call that her hooker's apparel. She had her makeup and hair done, did. Complete smoke show, by the way. Nancy was stunning. I can never understate how beautiful she was. And a totally down-to-earth person. Well, you know, except for the whole messy divorce situation with Kevin Sullivan and the Chris Benoit stuff. But yeah, aside from all that, she was pretty damn cool. Very smart to the business, too. And so, well, she pulls Rick into the hotel suite. The door shuts. And I kind of chalk it up to that great scene from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air when Carlton gets pulled into the hotel room by the girl he was dating at the time. And you get the whole pyro and fireworks clip. The fucking bumblebee penetrating the sunflower. It's just the greatest scene in the history of sitcom television. One of the greatest. A lot of Fresh Prince skits were great. That's the first thing I thought when I saw Nancy pull Rick into the room. I was just waiting for the explosion of fireworks and the fucking Beethoven music to play. And we didn't get it. I was so disappointed. We got Great Balls of Fire, which was a very apropos song for this particular scene. And let me just say for the record, I did not outright hate anything they did here. It just, again, kind of exposed the whole identity crisis with WCW during this time. Every attempt they could make at being a horrible, watered-down, low-down, carbon copy of the WWF. That's what they were trying to be. From the gimmicks to the hokey pre-tapes to just everything that used to be counter-programming. They went completely in the opposite direction. To the point where I was even asking simple questions like, why is there a cameraman randomly following JR and Rick Steiner through a hotel? Why are there like 8 camera cuts in between shots? How many fucking cameramen were assigned to be a part of this? Things like that. Lack of attention to detail. So with that monologue out of the way, let's move things along here and quickly gloss over the next segment. Tommy Rich and the Enforcer had an incredibly boring TV match that Tommy won with a Thez press. Then we had a Lex Luger promo. He did not want to respond to the lady that chastised JR. In fact, Luger took that letter and ripped it in half. And I guarantee you that same girl would still want to fuck Luger if given the chance. Always remember, boys. Chicks dig assholes. It's a sad reality of the world, but once you recognize it, you can't unsee it. So Luger spent a couple minutes talking about how he doesn't need to come out wearing fancy $100 dress shirts. When you have a $10 million body like he does, a dress shirt is just a piece of expensive cloth. You may as well show off your natural goods if you have them. He's not entirely off base with that. I have like 10 or 15 dress shirts in my closet right now, and I still would probably trade all that in for Luger's body if I could. He talked about Tommy Rich for a bit and said he's pissing him off. So he should stay out of his way if he knows what's good for him. Damn. I wish I had my Luger sound drop queued up. Anytime I mention Lex Luger being pissed, it's the perfect time to play that audio clip of him. I don't know where that is in my files. I haven't used any sound drops on this channel for a while. I just kind of got lazy. Anyway, they showed a highlight package of some recent Dr. Death Mike Rotunda amateur rules matches. And there was one common denominator with all 3 of these. Some kind of fucked finish or controversial angle that took place. Which I think was the precursor that set up their TV match a couple weeks ago. And I even remember saying at the time, the work between the two is good, but they really have not capitalized well on the Varsity Club breakup. I had almost forgotten that Dr. Death turned babyface earlier in the summer and broke away from the Varsity Club. I mean, they just really were not pushing that story on television all that much. So they aired those. Then Dr. Death came out and squashed Bill Ford in about 2 minutes. The best part was the finish where he actually had Tommy Young trapped in the corner when he was setting up the Oklahoma Stampede. Poor guy almost got trampled. And he also did a quick follow-up promo where he talked about how accomplished Rotunda is in the world of amateur wrestling, but Dr. Death has also accomplished plenty, not just in the world of amateur wrestling, but pro wrestling as well. And I mean, that was pretty much it. They're apparently going to wrestle again at some point down the road. Only other thing I noted here was when he randomly gave Cornette the Jim Duggan Ho salute. I don't know what that was all about. I was like, hey, quit stealing Hacksaw's gimmick. Next thing you're telling me Dr. Death is going to come out with a 2x4 and start hitting people over the back with it. I wish someone would have hit me with a 2x4 so I didn't have to watch the next match they aired. Oh yeah, I had to bring this up too. This is hilarious. Y'all know how much I get on WWE's case for the shameless sponsor plugs on those fucking PLEs. How's this for shameless? Ric Flair being announced as the A&W Cream Soda World Champion. And this was quite the trophy Bob Caudle presented him with. An impressive trophy. They really went above and beyond to make this thing look special. Ric Flair could not have possibly given less of a shit. Which is what made it great. The only thing missing here was a Woo Wings plug. If only Flair had jumped on the bandwagon sooner. Could have gotten some legendary Ric Flair commercials. What was it? Woo Energy and Woo Wings? Good times. So, yeah, the match I was dreading. It's the Samoan SWAT team versus Rich Sartain and Greg Evans. It wasn't even a bad match. It was just very uneventful. The Samoans are a weird case study in WCW. Like, they came in with all this fanfare and hype earlier in the year. You even remember at one point, like, they were talking about how these guys were on the brink of surpassing the Road Warriors in terms of being the most lethal, devastating tag team in the company. And they were being pushed that way for a period of time. And how long were they undefeated for? It was a while. But it's like, as soon as they wrapped up the feud with Corny and Paul Lee at the Great American Bash, the Samoans were just kind of there. A lot like how the Midnight Express were kind of there, but I at least have more extensive knowledge about some of the stuff the Midnights did before they left WCW in 1990. I legitimately do not remember what happens with Fatu and Samu before they leave for the WWF and become the Head Shrinkers in a few years. The only thing I recall is that at some point before the end of the year, they end up replacing Paul Heyman with Oliver Humperdinck as their manager. I don't even remember how he came back. And I believe that pairing amounted to basically nothing. And granted, it's not to say the Head Shrinkers were the second coming of tag team wrestling in the mid-90s. But the run in the WWF was at least more eventful than anything they did in WCW post-Great American Bash. It's crazy. But that took us to the Dick Slater Gary Hart promo that they played a little bit of in the cold open. And to sort of piggyback on what we talked about earlier, the whole idea that Slater just randomly shows up here with Gary Hart and he's now part of the JTEX Corporation along with Terry Funk and the Great Muta. And don't get me wrong, the promo we cut on Sting was good. They were advertising a match between the two later in the program. And you had Gary talking about how we need to stay glued to our TV sets because today could very well be the day that the landscape of the business changes forever. The landscape did not change, for the record. He said the JTEX Corporation is going to continue to unveil their mission statement as they look to rid Sting and Flair from the wrestling business altogether. And it's a Gary Hart promo, so the delivery is fantastic. But again, it all goes back to what we said about people arbitrarily showing up with little fanfare from around this time. Like, at no point during this promo was there a why as to how Dick Slater became a part of Gary's faction. At least with Muta and Funk, it made sense, considering they were already feuding with Flair and Sting, respectively. But then, boom, here's Dickie Slater from out of the void, and well, now he's here. And the ironic part is, I don't think he's actually around for that long. Because he wrestles a tag match with Muta against Sting and Flair at the Clash of Champions in about a month. That was the infamous plastic bag angle that got WCW under hot water with the network. Like the whole thing about how you can't have gratuitous violence on a wrestling show that's all about gratuitous violence. But yeah, Slater was involved in that. And then I think he just vanishes. I don't remember anything Slater did until the point he came back and did the stud stable thing with Bunkhouse Buck, which I believe carried over into the Nitro era during the Monday Night Wars for a brief window of time. So there's like a 3 or 4 year gap where I just don't recall anything Slater was ever involved with. And I'm pretty sure he worked for WCW during a lot of that time. Lord knows I tried to watch WCW religiously from like 91 through 95. But man, shit was so bad at that point. If my brothers weren't watching the WWF, they were barely watching wrestling at all during those 4 years. I mean, I was consuming everything I could possibly get my hands on, but it was mostly older tapes from stuff they recorded from like 85, 86 up through pretty much 89. Enough about my childhood, though. Then we had one of the worst PTSD experiences I've had since 1987. So, how long ago was it I was comparing someone on one of these classic shows to Brad Armstrong? I think it was Steve Simpson in World Class. I was talking about how he had a lot going for him in terms of the look and the way he carried himself as a star on television. But then you had to watch his matches and it was like sifting through government-funded television. The most hideously boring television you could possibly watch. That was always my biggest criticism of Brad Armstrong, going back to those old Crockett shows. Guy was tremendously talented as an athlete, but fuck, dude. His matches were so mundane. Just a guy out there doing wrestling moves with no inspiration and no psychology. And I say that as someone who genuinely loves so many elements about the Armstrong family. But Brad's matches, dude, they were just sleep-inducing at times. So with that all said, guess who was back? We got Brad Armstrong versus the Cuban Assassin. Out of the sixth dimension of hell. Approximately 30 seconds into the match, as JR's putting over Brad's credentials, he said, almost a direct quote by the way, "Someday, I think we might finally see the best of Brad Armstrong." To which I said, yep. And Tony Schiavone and David Crockett were saying the exact same thing about Brad in 1987. And we're still fucking waiting. And I seriously don't mean to just make this whole thing a Brad Armstrong hit piece, because I know that people loved working with Brad. I know that he was an extremely down-to-earth person. Like, nobody ever spoke sideways about him. Complete professional. Great guy. But I'm sitting there watching him work with the Assassin. I'm just having mild flashbacks to having to watch those long, droning television matches on the Superstation a couple years ago. And it's not to say they didn't do a decent job here. In retrospect, it was one of the better matches on the program, not factoring in Sting and Slater. Then again, you're also comparing that to a bunch of lame television squashes. But they just keep going and going and going. And the crowd is not really all that into it. Nor are they really into Brad. To be fair, they haven't seen the fucking guy in like 2 years. And that was actually one compliment I could give a couple years ago when the fan base was mostly women at those studio shows. I mean, Brad was a good-looking guy, so they would go crazy whenever he came out. Here it was kind of a different story. And I'm watching Brad sell. He's getting worked over for seemingly hours on end. They finally build to a spot where the Assassin tries to give him a crossbody attack, but then Brad turns it into a cradle package and pins him. When it was over, I immediately said, how long do I give it before I just start fast-forwarding through all of Brad's matches again? Because it's either that or I get up to take a shit. I'll give it another week or two. If the next match I watch is Brad Armstrong doing nothing but arm drags and headlocks for 15 minutes, fuck it. I'll enjoy my long shit on the Johnson. So then we came back for a Danger Zone segment. And let's jump back in the time machine 2 weeks to break this down, because if you missed a review a couple weeks ago, well, this still wouldn't make any sense regardless, but hear me out. So the Iron Sheik made his return, and he was seen showing up during a Ron Simmons match to basically play cheerleader for him. Now, we were told at the time that he's not looking to form a tag team with Simmons. Rather, he's looking to train him and take him under his wing, so to speak, for reasons. But now we have a more clear idea as to what Sheik's motive is. None of which was understandable during his promo, because, well, the Iron Sheik was talking. Here's the best I can make of it. He's looking to not only train Ron, but to also bring in somebody to team up with him. someone who he believes is just as qualified and just as tough as Ron. Now, at first, I heard this and I'm like, wait, Doom isn't even a thing until like Halloween Havoc in October. And the Iron Sheik had nothing to do with that. He can't be talking about Butch Reed, right? So I heard this and was immediately confused. And the longer this went on, the more I just started tuning out, because, I mean, none of this ever goes anywhere from what I remember. And it just got to a point where everybody started talking over each other, and finally I just said, fuck it, I can't handle it anymore. This was horrible. Speaking of people talking over each other, JR and the Freebirds had some fun, obnoxious banter back and forth. They started talking about Missy Hyatt coming out the other week to try to degrade the Freebirds. Meanwhile, it was clear to Hayes and Garvin that Missy's sexually frustrated, which was not entirely untrue if you know anything about her relationship status with Eddie Gilbert during this time. Anyway, they plugged the match with the Steiners for the Clash event in a month. So there's no chance in hell that Rick and Scott leave with the belts. At least they got their catchphrase right this time. And by that I mean Garvin wasn't lip-syncing it. And then we had the Birds in action against Bob Emery and Mark Smith. God, you want to talk about the quintessential Freebirds trying to work like they're the fucking Road Warriors. This goddamn match. Now I understand why Corny got frustrated when they had to work with the Midnights. And look, it's not to say that Michael Hayes and Jimmy Garvin needed to be bumping or selling for Mark Smith and Bob Emery in this match. But like at the points where the job guys are trying to throw some jabs back, and Hayes and Garvin aren't even registering anything. Or like at the finish when Garvin just shit-canned Mark Smith and dropped him with a DDT recklessly. Like that's the kind of stuff where you look at it and you're like, come on, dude. Can you be a pro for like 5 minutes? It's already laughable to buy the idea that Jimmy fucking Garvin is this unbreakable brick wall after having been a chicken shit heel for the majority of his career prior to that. But this was ridiculous at times. I mean, it's like these two refused to sell just out of spite. And it sucks too, because Garvin especially was a really good worker. But you watch the way he was working around this time when he was trying to be invincible and no-sell everything in the book. And you're just like, what the hell? Dude, you're like 220 pounds soaking wet. Get the fuck out of here. I'm actually looking forward to that match with the Steiners at the Clash, because, I mean, while I don't remember everything about that match move for move, we all know what happens when you get in the ring with the Steiner brothers. Whether you want to bump and sell or not, the Steiners are going to pick you up and throw you around regardless. So you either cooperate or it can get ugly in a hurry. So I'm interested to see if Garvin and Hayes actually bother to sell for those two, whether it's by force or not. We had a Ric Flair promo to plug the upcoming tag match at the Clash, which they are currently still advertising as Flair and Sting versus Muta and Funk. But I'm not entirely sure when they pull Funk from that and replace him with Slater. And it was kind of your standard paint-by-numbers Ric Flair promo. He vowed that he'd wash the face paint off Muda, said Funk was going to bleed and sweat like his life depended on it. They are really trying to sell this tag match as a big deal for Fall Brawl, which, well, it certainly left a legacy. Not necessarily for the better, as we found out. But that's a discussion we'll have in a few weeks when we review the match. That brought us to Fred Avery and Flying Brian. He was here where JR and Jim Cornette mentioned the partying and training that Brian and Ric Flair were doing together, which I would certainly love to see clips of that. If they can show Rick Steiner going to a hotel room to fuck Robin Green, certainly we can get some video footage of Brian Pillman and Ric Flair hanging out together. That would be tremendous television. It would surely be better than having to watch Brian Pillman feud with Norman the Lunatic, which, yes, is still a thing for the record. There was a fleeting moment here where Norman tried to run out and get involved, but then Pillman drop-kicked him off the apron and, well, Norman and Teddy just left. That was your 10-second cameo of Norman the Lunatic this week. And then Pillman just wound up going over a minute later with a move. I say a move because I completely forgot to write it down and didn't care enough to go back and look. Again, hour mark. I was sort of tapping out mentally by this point. We had the Bounty Hunter and the Cruel Connection versus the Steiners. Now with Missy Hyatt and Robin Green at ringside in the Steiners' corner. Every heterosexual male's wet dream. And, well, aside from Rick stealing Cruel Connection's cape and wearing it for like the first minute of the match, the only other thing I noted about this was the Steiners picking up and tossing around both jobbers while the girls stood at ringside and admired them. Scotty, I think, eventually got the win with a belly-to-belly on the Bounty Hunter. Then they had a promo, which was far and away more interesting than anything in the match. The whole thing was Scott trying to plug the match with the Freebirds while you had women standing in the background prodding and stroking Rick Steiner, lusting over his genetics. And, well, Rick was not all that enthused by the constant stroking. In fact, he was quite annoyed by it. The thing that made it interesting, though, is that out of all the people involved in this one segment, think about this. The most level-headed, sane one of the pack. It had to have been Scotty Steiner. It is so funny when I go back and listen to milquetoast Scott Steiner on the mic, especially knowing who he was about to become in about 10 years. The whole Big Papa Pump run. You go back and look at old tapes of him, and you're like, who the fuck is this guy? God, he was so dry and vanilla. Looked fantastic, but yeah, promos were not Scott's thing when he first got started in the business. So that led us to the TV main event. Finally. Thank God. It's Sting versus Dickie Slater. And let me just say up front here, this is a great TV main event. Great match. Great closing angle. I mean, this whole thing had Ric Flair's fingerprints all over it. Everything worked so well. The only thing that weighed it down for me was the fact that it came an hour and change into the show when I was just mentally drained. I mean, had they done this at the top of hour one, or I'm sorry, top of hour two, instead of at the end of hour two when the program was about to be over, I probably would be sitting here right now calling this one of the better things we've seen on WCW programming since maybe the Flair Funk angle at the Wrestle War pay-per-view in May. That's how good it was. Now, it's not to say the Sting Slater match is a 5-star classic or anything, but given the fact that it got like 10 or 11 minutes overall, I was never bored with it. The people were super into it, especially when Sting was selling and working from underneath. The thing with Dick Slater is that people don't often talk about how good he was because if you really think about it, he only wrestled on a major American platform for several years during his career. If you weren't watching Midsouth or even some of the early Georgia tapes from the 70s and early 80s, and you probably haven't seen a whole lot of Dick Slater footage. There's so much history out there, but a lot of it isn't documented on tape, unfortunately. By the time I started watching wrestling, Slater was definitely on the downturn of his career. But even so, he and the Stinger had a hell of a TV main event. The crowd was very much into it, like I said. And it all led to this hella great angle at the end. So Sting's making his comeback on Slater, and you see him go to give Slater the big babyface dive over the top of the floor. They both go down in a heap. If you actually watch too, Sting lands on the ground and kind of favors his knee momentarily, and you see Slater crawl over and do the thing where he taps his arm a few times, probably to check to make sure he was okay, because it was a nasty bump Sting took. But he was fine. And as they get up and Sting's about to roll Slater back into the ring, that's when Muda and Funk run out for the disqualification as everybody starts gangbanging Sting in the ring. And you know, all the crap you hear people like me give modern wrestling for all the phony fake brawls we see take place now, where everything happens at a glacial pace and it's so obviously phony. Like, nothing ever looks legit these days. It's all stagey and overproduced. This is the kind of brawl shit that I miss in wrestling, man. Where the heels are trying to kill a babyface as quickly as possible before reinforcement comes out. Like, even when guys like Flair and Pillman try to run out to make the save, like, they get shit canned immediately at first because they're still at the numbers disadvantage. And as it looks like the heels are about to get the better of the baby faces, it's when Flair comes back with Gary Hart's branding iron, and he starts going to town on Slater's arm with it. And it's all pandemonium with guys throwing chairs around. You have the standoff with everybody around ringside. Crowd is just going crazy for everything. People ask, okay, so what should I watch if I'm trying to get into wrestling? What old school clips can I go back and watch to see how this shit used to be done the correct way? Go watch something like this. This is the kind of stuff that I miss seeing on a consistent basis. If we saw more shit like this in today's product, I would absolutely be more on board with putting over modern wrestling. And I'll even overlook the absurdity of the branding iron. As silly as that gimmick is in wrestling, at least they sold it the right way. Something to mention too. It's cool how Pillman's getting thrust into all this. But it's not being forced. They've addressed the friendship between him and Flair. Seeing him involved with the main event guys doesn't seem so haphazard. So I loved everything about this. It was funny too, because when they initially advertised the Sting Slater main event, it reminded me of an old story I heard somebody mention about those two from the UWF a couple years prior. And I don't remember the whole backstory. I'm totally freeballing this one. But I think Slater had just broken up with Dark Journey. You may remember, she actually had a brief stint in Crockett in the spring of '87 when she was Tully Blanchard's valet for a hot minute. And then, well, one day she was just gone. And we never heard from her again. It was like Baby Doll. She was there and then, poof, gone the next. But yeah, that same Dark Journey. Yeah, she and Slater had broken up or whatever. Can't remember it. Was she a stripper or something? I'd have to look that up. But yeah, things ended between those two. And I think she ended up asking Sting if they could carpool together because she was still booked to make appearances for the UWF. And when someone stooged that Sting had brought her to one of the venues and Slater found out, he basically jumped Sting in the locker room and gave him a swirly just to rib him. Again, I don't know how true that story is. It totally sounds like something Dickie would have done. But it made me laugh because I'm just watching them out there working together and they seem perfectly fine doing business. Apparently that UWF run-in was water under the bridge. No hard feelings. Yeah, I know I beat your ass a few years ago, Stinger, but yeah, fuck it, let's go out there and do some business together. What do you say? And Sting, the good Christian man, said, right on, brother. Wrestling's a beautiful thing, man. Guys can hate each other, but when it comes bell time, still got to be a pro. Protect your man at all costs. So when I look at the show overall, kind of just wish I would have watched the main event. If this entire episode was nothing but the closing 15 minutes, I'd be praising this thing to the moon right about now. I mean, it wasn't a rotten program. You could tell things are slowly shifting with the booking. I don't remember exactly when Flair took the book full-time in '89. He may have already been a part of the committee by this point, as far as we know. Because again, that final segment had a whole lot of old-school NWA elements that we really used to see a lot during the Crockett regime. That used to be a frequent weekly thing. The problem, though, is that, even with Flair becoming head booker for a brief window, and things did actually turn around with the product for a brief period of time in the fall, he wasn't really that much in control of things. Especially with Jim Herd breathing down his neck nonstop. But this is definitely an improvement over a lot of what we've been seeing previously. Say that much. Still got plenty of problems, but the product wasn't a complete lost cause yet. Holy shit, Joel Watts actually had a format this week. Well, color me pink. And all this time I thought he was just stubborn. Now, did him having a format make his commentary any better? No, of course not. He was still god-awful. So awful, in fact, that even Boyd Pierce wouldn't let him get a word in edgewise. This opening dialect is phenomenal. Boyd's talking about how articulate and well-spoken Joel is, how he's coming along so well with his commentary. Bullshit. And right as he goes, Joel's going to talk about so-and-so and such and such. Immediately, without skipping a beat, Boyd pitches to a pre-taped interview with Ernie Ladd and Buddy Landel. You know it's bad when even Boyd won't let you say anything during the cold open. Now, as far as the interview with Ernie and Buddy, it was all a precursor to set up the rematch between Buddy Landel and Brickhouse Brown for later on. Here's what Buddy found out the past week. He found out that Grizzly Smith and Bill Watts brought in Brickhouse as a ringer. Turns out the guy was one of the toughest men in all of combat sports. And they used poor Buddy as a whipping boy just to jerk him around and rib him. So now Buddy thought ahead. And he brought in Ernie Ladd, since he's also one of the toughest and smartest athletes in all of pro wrestling. He was going to show Buddy some tricks to make sure he got the better of Brickhouse this week. And, well, it kind of goes back to what we talked about last week during the recap. Now that JYD is officially gone from the territory, you had Watts using every desperate knee-jerk ploy imaginable to try to replace him. So not only did Brickhouse Brown beat Buddy Landel in 2 straight falls, but now they're sitting here a week later putting him over as one of the toughest men in all of sports. Not just pro wrestling. Every sport. And again, there's something to be said about the idea of wanting to push a new guy to get him over. This Brickhouse Brown situation is kind of entering the territory of forcing a guy over, if you really think about it. All in an attempt to see how quickly they could shovel Dog under the bus. Like, hey, check out this really talented black babyface that totally isn't here to replace JYD. It's the whole pay no attention to the man behind the curtain cliche. Anyway, we'll revisit the Brickhouse conversation later. From there, we pitch back to the ring for a Midnight Express versus PYTs match. I'd like for somebody to explain to me what the hell was going on with the canned crowd noise during the Midnight's entrance. It sounded like the entire Irish McNeil Boys Club was filled with nothing but 14-year-old schoolgirls. Just constant squealing and whistling and high-pitched noises. Like nobody in the building was actually applauding or standing for Dennis and Bobby. Which makes sense. They're fucking heels. They're supposed to be hated. But the dub Midnight's music here made it sound like they were babyfaces this week. It was so bizarre. Oh yeah, by the way, Bobby Eaton was perfectly fine. You know the whole angle last week where Terry Taylor came out and ran him into the ring post, rendered Bobby unable to compete in that tag match? Yeah, he seemed none the worse for wear here. So this is amazing. It's already hilarious to me seeing the visual of Hercules Hernandez standing at ringside as a bodyguard. This week they managed to level up the comedy. So Hercules is sitting in a chair with his arms crossed. And about halfway through the match, here comes Hacksaw Duggan from literally out of nowhere. I have no idea where he snuck in from, but he just started marching around ringside opposite the hard cam, being all goofy. And so you see Duggan in one frame, and then from literally out of the void, you just see him come running toward Hercules and spearing the shit out of him. Knocked him right out of the chair. Looked like two freight trains colliding. And so with Hercules down selling, Duggan went after Cornette to try to get his hands on him while he had the chance. He picks his ankles and manages to hold him down to tease that he's going to shave his head. But then the other heels cut him off and manage to save him. Then you had Coco Ware giving everybody the safest chair shots you've ever seen right before the Midnight's powdered. Looked like Vader giving Shawn Michaels that powerbomb on the floor from SummerSlam. Gently letting him down to the point where you were wondering if it would even hurt a toddler. That's what Coco's chair shots looked like. I'm all for protecting a guy, but you gotta lay it in just a little bit. But it was a good segment. The match was more or less superfluous, but it accomplished what it needed to. And it was a great setup for the next segment. Now, one thing I didn't mention during that melee was that Hercules got busted open. And it was actually kind of weird. The premise here seemed to be that Coco was responsible for opening up Hercules with a chair shot. Which, by the way, great attention to detail here. That's going to result in a $10,000 fine, courtesy of Watts' new rule he instituted over the use of chairs in Midsouth. Here's the problem, though. It was very clear during that brawl that Hercules was bleeding well before Coco ever started hitting anybody with a chair. I thought Hercules gigged himself after Duggan had run him headfirst into the guardrail. But maybe I was mistaken. So the match is supposed to be Hercules versus Mike Jackson. But Cornette and Hercules want Coco to come down to the ring so they could get a piece of him for what he just did. And that is exactly what we got. An impromptu Coco Ware Hercules Hernandez match. And once you get past the whole fucked up psychology of the bloody heel valiantly fighting and struggling to overcome the obstacle of the fresher babyface, it's a good little TV match. It's funny as I go back and rewatch Hercules Hernandez from around this time. I always knew how good he was. I hesitate to say he was tremendously underrated as a big man athlete, because I think people recognize that Hercules was a great talent back in the day. Vince unfortunately never really used him to his fullest potential, I don't think. But it has to be said, Hercules is really good, dude. Really good. It really wasn't that often you saw guys with that kind of physique being able to do the kind of stuff Hercules was capable of doing. But shit, he could go, man. I would say he was the total package before Lex Luger ever stole that gimmick. And as good as Luger was, I would still probably say Hercules had a leg up over him. Is that insensitive to say, considering Luger's wheelchair bound? Now, whatever. So from there, we kind of went from the penthouse to the outhouse for a little bit. Actually, before I mention that, let me address this Dr. Death promo. And last week, if you recall, he devoted an entire segment to crowning himself the champion of, the world, basically. He had a custom football helmet made for himself because he wanted to show that he was a real champion. Unlike Terry Taylor, who claims to be the TV champion, but he also wouldn't stand up to Dr. Death when taking his medal back after it was stolen. So now the story is Dr. Death is issuing open challenges to all the tough guys in the back. Anyone that wants to try to take the helmet from him. And well, there are apparently no takers as of this point. The babyfaces had a week to think about it, and nobody wanted to challenge Dr. Death for that goofy fake trophy helmet. I figured it out. I think I see the comedy here. It's not that none of the babyfaces want to challenge Williams to a fight. They just don't give a shit about the football helmet. By the way, I liked how Dr. Death referred to Magnum TA here as Terry Allen. It's a shoot, brother. He used his Christian name. They must have heat. You know what didn't have heat? The match I'm about to talk about. It got heat with me for being so horrible, but that's beside the point. The match is Sonny King versus Hans Schroeder. And I know what you're all thinking. It sucked because of Sonny King, right? Yes. But here's the thing. It actually wasn't that terrible. It was still bad, but it wasn't like off the rails unwatchable or anything. The problem is that every time I have to watch Sonny King in the ring, it literally looks like somebody wrestling underwater. I can't even begin to describe the body movements of Sonny, but they are just comically atrocious. It's like every parody of a wrestling sitcom you've ever seen. Like when other shows try to do wrestling satire, people acting like pro wrestlers. I'm not kidding you, they all move and work exactly like Sonny King. People that obviously have no training and no experience. It's indescribably bad. And I actually lied. I said the match wasn't terrible. It wasn't terrible up until the last 30 seconds. On top of Schroeder getting completely blown up, Sonny was just fucking up shit left and right. Looked like two guys trying to do spots in bubble wrap. He ended up giving Schroeder this awkward looking headbutt where it just kind of looked like he collapsed into Schroeder. And they both fell down in a heap. I laughed. That's all I could do. I honestly have nothing against Sonny King personally. But if I woke up tomorrow never having to review or see another Sonny King match for as long as I live, I would not be upset. So that took us to Buddy Landell and Brickhouse Brown. Buddy with his now advisor, Ernie Ladd. Yeah, I'm sure that won't aggravate Butch Reed. Oh, before I talk about what happened here, I wanted to mention something Boyd Pierce brought up. He said that Adrian Street was going to be making his TV debut next week. Which got me thinking, weren't we supposed to see a hype package with Adrian like 2 weeks ago? Did they just forget to play it? because I do not remember reviewing or talking about it. That seems to happen quite frequently in a lot of these old territory tapes. Like the announcers will mention an upcoming debut or something pertaining to a specific talent, like a video package, what have you, and then they just won't play it. Or they won't bring it up for the remainder of the program. Most of the time I forget because I'm old. I just don't have a good memory anymore. But I remember the Adrian Street thing. It's weird how they never actually played the video package for him. But they talked about it. So here's what we had in this match. Buddy got his ass kicked for about 98% of it. Brickhouse just dominated and showed him up at every turn. There was a fleeting moment where Ernie tripped him up in the ropes, which he sold great, by the way. Carl Fergie went over to admonish him, and Ernie just looked up and shrugged his shoulders like, "Hey, I don't know, dude. I'm just standing here." And so, well, Buddy tried to drop an awkward elbow, but Brickhouse moved. From there, he started throwing a series of drop kicks to both Buddy and Ernie. And then eventually, Buddy just threw his hands up and said, "Fuck it." And he got himself intentionally counted out. It was painfully obvious to see just how immobile Ernie was at this stage of his career. He could barely take a bump over the top rope without looking like he was about to cripple himself. Poor guy. I loved Ernie, but yeah, 1984 was most definitely the twilight of his peak athleticism. He did not have much left in the tank. You know, again, there was nothing wrong with anything they did here. It all just goes back to the conversation about them trying to establish Brickhouse. There's putting a guy over, and then there's the, you must accept this man as the next top black babyface of the territory. And you can tell which category Brickhouse falls into just based on the booking in the last 2 weeks alone. And again, nothing against him. Brickhouse was a solid worker, but he was no JYD. Nor was he ever going to be. No matter how much Watts wanted to try to force that on everybody. But as we'll see, Brickhouse wasn't the only guy Watts tried to incessantly force into that top spot. So then we came back. As God is my witness, I'm not shitting you. They actually replayed the Cringe Fantastics hype package that I buried like a month ago. I even complimented the new video they showed of them working out the other week. Thought it was a perfect replacement for that horrible first video they aired. But I guess it was a personal favorite of Joel's, so we just had to see it again. Probably something to be said about the idea that Joel liked watching a video where two women were seen making out with Bobby and Tommy. Not saying that's weird, but there might be a fetish there that we don't know about. Anyway, we got the Fantastics versus Art Cruz and Randy Barber. I wrote down the following bullet points. Women swoon over Bobby and Tommy. Fantastics win with the assisted diving splash. For the record, Tommy Rogers crushed Barber's face with that body splash. Holy fuck, that looked brutal. Then we got a Magnum TA video. Did you know that Magnum TA is the current North American champion? Yeah, I keep forgetting too. Sad, isn't it? They gave him a whole new belt and everything. Spent like months and months building him up as the next big babyface challenger to finally overcome the odds and win the big one. It just seems like Magnum's the one guy on this roster that we see the least of consistently now. And he's supposed to be their top champion. I mean, the video was just a 90-second highlight clip of him doing some wrestling matches and then riding around on his Harley. Sprinkle in the occasional thing where he was making out with some random chicks. It was a cool video, but you know what would be cooler? Seeing Magnum actually have a fucking feud. We did get Ernie Ladd and Crusher Khrushchev versus Rick McCord and Josh Stroud. I like how Khrushchev is now just randomly teaming with different heel partners every week. He was, clearly on the outs with Midsouth by this point in '84. Now that Volkov was gone and Khrushchev wasn't really feuding over the TV title, there's really not a whole lot else for him to do. I might have to go back and rewatch this for next week. I'm pretty sure Ernie switched ring trunks for this match. I do not remember him wearing red tights and boots when he was out there bumping around with Buddy Landell earlier. Could be wrong. Wasn't paying that close attention to Ernie's gear from earlier. But it looked different. Not really a whole lot to say about it. Heels worked over the job guys for a while until Ernie went over with a leg drop. Again, he was barely able to do much of anything here. Khrushchev did mostly all the work. I mean, it was good to see Ernie back, but I think we kind of knew what we were getting with him in 1984. The answer was not much. And that left us with a Jim Cornette promo to close things out. And we still have some unsettled business from earlier. When Corny was out there ranting and raving with Hercules, he had mentioned the $10,000 fine for Coco using a chair on the Midnights, so that Coco needs to come out and pay up front. Cornette wants to see action be put to these new roles that Mid-South instituted. But here's where the plot thickens. Norvell and Coco come out to basically say, "Look, ma'am, we don't have $10,000. We can't and we will not pay the $10,000 fine. And more importantly, we are not leaving the Mid-South area." Now, of course, you had JR relaying the information to them. "Look, boys, the rules stipulate that if you use a chair, a 2x4, a chain, or a tennis racket, you're going to be fined $10,000. And if you can't pay it, you're indefinitely suspended." And now you might recall some of the previous conversations we've had about the PYTs. I mentioned how their stay in Mid-South was relatively abrupt. I mean, they really weren't around that long before they left the area. I may be wrong. Lord knows I've been wrong plenty of times. I'm thinking we may have figured out why the PYTs departed Mid-South. Or at least how they departed Mid-South. Whether it was kayfabe or not, they couldn't afford to pay the 10 grand. So I guess they were booted. That might actually be how Norvell and Coco were written out in storyline. I mean, that would make sense, given how short their stay was. But I guess we'll have to wait and see what the explanation is. It's funny how they would actually give a storyline reason for guys to be written out of the territory. Most of the time, people are just up and left. But the PYTs basically did say here, yeah, fuck you, we're not paying the fine. Yeah, they're baby faces. But as we all know in the world of Midsouth, nobody is above the law. So I'm thinking the PYTs are in for a rude awakening if they don't pony up the cash. By the way, what the hell does that mean? We can't afford to pay the 10 grand. The fuck was Bill Watts paying these guys? Pennies on the dollar. Unacceptable. Come on, man. It was a good cliffhanger, though. You know, I thought this was a really solid episode. I liked the direction they took with the Midnight's Duggan story. This little detour of throwing in the PYTs thing and, you know, doing a show-long story where Coco basically screwed himself out of 10 grand for overstepping his bounds. I mean, these aren't elaborate, well-thought-out storylines or anything, but I sometimes find that some of the best material is the stuff that takes place throughout the course of the show. They come back and revisit stuff from previous segments. I don't know, it makes everything seem more off the cuff instead of boring and formulaic. But yeah, good episode. I still would like to see more of Magnum TA, considering he's supposed to be the guy right now. Apparently he's having more fun riding his motorcycle and working part-time schedules. Doesn't that sound oddly familiar? A wrestling organization with a top champion who's only active for 4 months out of the year. You know, we joke about it back then, but seems very commonplace these days. Alright, so let's round it out here with a world-class review. The show that continues to exist. The pimple on the ass of the territories here in 1986. Nah, that's cruel. I'm just joshing. Trust me, if you thought World Class was bad around this time, go watch some Memphis TV from around the same time period. Things weren't so hot there either. In fact, most of the territories were pretty miserable by the late 80s. Maybe the only exception to that rule was the UWF. But it also accounts for why they all went under. You know, once all the big talents started going to work for either Vince or Crockett, it was pretty much over. Yeah, right now World Class is still running with this tag team tournament to crown new champions. And no, I'm not referring to the 6-man world titles. We're talking about 2-man belts. It's also one of those tournaments where there's only like maybe 1 or 2 conceivable outcomes as to who could possibly go over. If you're betting the farm on it being Matt Bourne and Buzz Sawyer, you, my friend, are a great prognosticator. And speaking of the handsome twosome, we had a prelim match this week with Bourne and Sawyer taking on the Batten twins. This was not a tournament round, I believe. Although you could have easily mistaken it as one if you weren't paying attention. Buzz Sawyer has a new freshly shaved head. He looked even more crazy and wackier than normal. By the way, I actually took the time to jot down the tag teams that are a part of this tournament. Bill Mercer went through all the various teams and gave us a little more insight on who's actually going to be a part of this thing. Here's who we have to work with. And you're probably going to raise some eyebrows here and there, but just roll with it. Currently booked/announced for this World Tag Team Tournament, in addition to Buzz Sawyer and Matt Bourne, we have the following teams: Kevin Sullivan and Mark Lewin, who, for those that may not know your Florida history off the top of your head, they were both part of the Army of Darkness, which was Sullivan's heel cult faction. Kevin and Mike Von Erich. Mark and Chris Youngblood. Okay. Stop right there. Did I have a stroke the other week? Did we not see Mark Youngblood get eliminated from the tournament after he and Brian Adias lost to Bourne and Sawyer? So that wasn't a tournament round then? Did I just dream that Bill Mercer said it was a tournament match? The hell's going on? Newcomers Rick Rude and Joe LeDuc. Okay. Not really sure how that's going to work out because Rude's going to be gone from the territory in about 2 or 3 weeks. Ted and Jerry Oates, who were a pretty well-known tag team dating all the way back to the early 80s. We used to see Jerry Oates work underneath matches on Midsouth television back in like 82. Lance Von Erich and Bruiser Brody, which is quite the pair. Steve Simpson and Chris Adams. Brian Adias and Scott Casey, which, okay, guess it confirms my theory that the match we saw the other week with Youngblood and Adias was not an actual tournament round. Either that or they were given a second chance. Killer Brooks and the Grappler. And to cap it all off, the real main event tag team of this fucking fiasco, the Dingo Warrior and Socko. Excuse me, what? The Dingo Warrior and Socko. Great. So presumably Warrior is going to be teaming up with Mick Foley's fucking gimmicked handsock. Phenomenal. Worst tournament ever. I don't even think we need to go on. That's the World Class Review this week, everybody. I'm wrapping it up early. Can only go downhill from here. I was so mesmerized by this, I couldn't even focus on the match. By the way, is that 11 teams? I just now realized that. How the fuck do you have a single elimination tournament with 11 tag teams? Unless I missed one. Are the Batten twins a part of this? So, assuming the Battens are also in it, 12 teams. Okay. At least we got an even number. To be honest with you, I was surprised to hear they could even come up with 12 teams. Given the state of this roster in 1986. Which probably accounts for why they're having to bring in Sullivan and Lewin and a couple other random pairings. The Oates brothers. Anyway, back to the match at hand. The one I was barely paying attention to. So the heels got some heat on one of the battens for a while. And they continue to get heat on the battens. They had several visual pin attempts on the battens. And then finally, Matt Bourne just came off the top of the seated splash and got the pin. No comeback. No babyface flurry. Just heels beat the shit out of the babyfaces for 10 minutes and won with a finish. Cool. Sucks to be the Battens. And they are allegedly a part of this tournament. How? Well, the answer is obviously, we need bodies. I did laugh when Sawyer came in to cut off the other Batten twin at the end. Guy took a bump and landed right on top of his brother's left arm. That had to have sucked. So from there we came back for what was apparently supposed to be a Gary Hart interview. But instead we got Percy Pringle out here to crash the party. And well, he had a few things to get off his chest. First, he informed us that Chris Adams had done a very nice job keeping Rick Rude's belt warm for him after a successful title defense against Tatsubi Fujinami over in Japan. And now it's time for Adams to step up and get back in the ring with some better competition. By the way, if that footage is out there, Chris Adams versus Tatsumi Fujinami, I'd love to fucking see that. You kidding? Instead of replaying the 475th brawl between Abdullah the Butcher and Bruiser Brody, they ought to be airing more stuff like that. How hard would it have been to get permission from New Japan? Or was it all Japan? I'd have to look that up. But the other thing Percy addressed here was the newest member of his dynasty. And that was, of course, none other than Joe LeDuc. We heard that he was coming to Dallas a few weeks ago, and to put it bluntly, I was shocked when I heard that Joe LeDuc came to World Class in 1986. I thought they were ribbing. Sure as shit. Here the bastard was. In the flesh, live and in living color. And boy, did he cut quite the promo. Got on the mic and said that he's been all over the world wrestling, but he wanted to come to Dallas because he heard that this is the best place with the best competition. He doesn't want to wrestle no nice guys. He doesn't want to wrestle no small guys either. He wants them big, he wants them tough, and he wants them rugged. He said that he wants guys that can back off what they say. Just like how LeDuc backs off what he says and does. And I'll tell you something, man. The promo material was one thing, but those eyes told the story. Crazy wild eyes. Now that's a fucking gimmick right there. That's the kind of wild, burly man that you wouldn't want to be caught dead in the alleyway picking a fight with. And now I see why Cornette loves talking about Joe LeDuc so much. Look at the guy. Dude was a walking personality. And it did carry over into the next match. LeDuc had his match with Michael McGillibuddy, otherwise known as Perry Jackson, but no one gives a fuck. I loved how creeped out Bill Mercer was by LeDuc, constantly putting over his 1,000-yard stare, and how eerie his presence was. And it was by no means a technical masterpiece. Just a mean, ugly lumberjack beating the crap out of a job guy for several minutes. It was absolutely a match that every modern fan would shit on nowadays, because, I mean, it was nothing but slow lumbering offense for 5 minutes. And you know what? I get it. I mean, I just sat here and bitched about Brad Armstrong doing nothing but arm drags and chin locks for his match on the Superstation. Guilty as charged. Difference, though, is that Brad was nowhere near the personality of Joe LeDuc. Also, you have to take into account that he was like 44 in 1986. It might not seem old by today's standards, but back in the 80s, especially with all the damage LeDuc did to his body over the years, I'm surprised that guy could even walk by 1986. I am still intrigued to see how long he sticks around. Probably don't need to see him wrestle every week, but I'd certainly love to hear him cut a promo occasionally, especially with that glassy look. Okay, and then we had what I would like to properly coin about 4 to 6 weeks of storyline content crammed into about 12 minutes of television time. Now, before I get anywhere else, I have to kind of set the stage here and mention a huge gaffe on the taping schedule. In fact, this was so horribly botched on World Class's part. I'm surprised nobody in the office ever said anything. This is the kind of thing that, if the exact same thing happened in 2025 with a taped wrestling program, people would have been skewering this on the internet. And rightfully so. I mean, I don't even know where to begin. There's so much to this. All right, well, let's start here. 1 week ago, the Dingo Warrior scored an upset non-title victory over the world champion Chris Adams. Pretty big deal, one might argue. And that's not even the most critical part to that segment. Not only did Warrior defeat Chris Adams clean in the middle of the ring, as a heel, mind you, he was also accompanied at ringside with his then new manager, we thought, Percy Pringle. There was never any explanation for it. In fact, I even recall mentioning at the time, this makes no sense. What's going on here? Well, as it turns out, we got our answer the following week when we got this segment. It is a heel versus heel match. No build-up. Rick Rude taking on the Dingo Warrior. Now remember, 7 days ago, in the past, the Dingo Warrior and Percy Pringle were linked together. 7 days later, the Dingo Warrior is now back to having Gary Hart as his manager, and Percy Pringle is now on the opposing side with Rick Rude. And mind you, he's not managing both men. He's opposed to the Dingo Warrior. Now, one might ask, how is this possible? Well, I think the answer is obvious. Somebody royally fucked up in the taping block. They apparently shot the breakup with Warrior and Gary Hart and aired it after we had already seen Percy and Warrior together as a unit. When I don't think we were supposed to. This is so screwed up in more ways than one. So that was one issue. The other issue, going back to the whole thing of cramming in weeks of storyline content into about 10 minutes. In addition to randomly booking this heel versus heel match with no rhyme or reason, no setup, no context, nothing, the Dingo Warrior also is apparently now a babyface with approximately zero build-up. Now, did he truly turn face, or did the crowd just like him more than Rick Rude? Jury's kind of still out on that one. We'll have to watch and see if he's an actual face by next week, or if the people just sided with Warrior for this one particular occasion. The point here, though, is, well, first off, why would you even go there to tease a Dingo Warrior heel turn when you clearly weren't even going that direction anyway? Well, I mean, I know the answer. The whole thing basically came about because they knew Rude was leaving the territory, and because they didn't have time to properly build up any real tension between Rude and Warrior on camera. I mean, they basically jumped from chapter 1 to the end of the book in less than a week. So all of this was horribly thrown together at the very last minute. And that really sucks too, because had they actually done this more thoroughly, it would have come off so much better on television. Because the people by the end were going nuts for the Dingo Warrior. And all he had to do was overpower and flex his muscles at Rude's expense. And the people in seeing that Warrior clearly had the size advantage, well, they all popped for him because he proved to be the better man in this scenario. And the Dallas faithful like winners. They don't like losers. And of course, you had all the stuff at the end with Gary Hart and Percy Pringle, which was fantastic. Two angry, bitter heel managers going after each other and trying to stir shit up. That was awesome. I mean, this had all the makings of being something truly great. If they didn't have to rush the whole goddamn thing in under 2 weeks. You had Rude and Warrior out there challenging each other to an arm wrestling contest for no apparent reason. Keep in mind, too, up until like the last 2 minutes, maybe, this match was all Warrior. Rude's out there getting his ass handed to him. And when the Warrior did have to sell at the end, it was after Percy ran interference and gave Rude the advantage. And then it pretty much directly led to the DQ after the ref couldn't get control of either guy. I mean, the only thing that didn't logically add up by the end here was the fact that there was no turn from Percy on Rude. Because Percy was still in Rude's corner by the end of the segment. So, assuming that breakup is yet to be aired, I mean, it has to be coming within the next week. Because I remember Rude is out of there by September. It was either September or October when he showed up in Crockett. So unless they taped about 5 weeks of television in the previous block, I'm assuming we'll officially see Warrior and Percy align sometime in the next week or two. And that'll be a constant going forward. The moral to the story here is tape television kind of sucks. Seriously, if you don't know what you're doing as a production agent, you can royally screw up stuff like this without even noticing. You know, I hate to say, how does crap like this even happen? But, I mean, it's happened plenty of times where things are taped and aired out of order and it completely throws off the chemistry of the program. But this kind of shit is like bare bones television production. It's like a cardinal rule to not screw up something like this. Sure enough, they did. So that left us with Lance Von Erich versus the Grappler. The epitome of following a gunfight with a pissing contest. You know, it's not often you'll ever hear me call a wrestling match pointless. I mean, yeah, standby matches are kind of redundant, but at least there will be something to talk about here and there. Plus, it's with job guys most of the time. No, this match was literally the definition of pointless. Not only was it boring and completely forgettable, they did not do jack shit here worth talking about. There was no excitement to it, no energy. Just a nothing happening mundane TV match to run out the clock. I'm not kidding you, here's everything I wrote. They did some spots. Lance won with a sunset roll-up. Even though he didn't actually win via roll-up, because Grappler clearly kicked out well before Bronco actually counted 3. But he just called for the bell anyway, because fuck it, who cares? I have literally nothing else to add. Lance Von Erich was such a lost cause by this point, dude. It has now gotten to a point with him where people are barely even reacting to his matches. It's a level of apathy that I have not seen from the Dallas faithful in quite some time. Especially with the top guy. And you know what? I cannot blame them. I mean, discount the whole issue with people being exposed to the reality that he wasn't a real member of the Von Erich family. His booking is so inconsistent. He's been one of those guys where we see him pop in every now and then, but then he'll randomly disappear for weeks at a time. He doesn't really seem to have any remotely interesting stories going on. He's barely featured in main event roles as it is. I just don't even know what to say anymore. I know he eventually leaves the territory after Fritz refused to pay him more money. Honestly, I'm surprised he lasted as long as he did. Considering the lack of return on investment they've gotten from Lance. And they put a lot of stock in him when he showed up. I remember the first image of him. Was it the Cotton Bowl last year? The hype was there, but good Lord, has he fallen flat. But there you have it. Hey, you know what? Give it this. At least there was some shit to talk about this week. It's always the one struggling thing with world class is you get the occasional thing here and there, but a lot of the time the shows are just kind of vanilla. Not really a whole lot to report on. But there was definitely a lot of historical context this week, so credit there. But I think that's it. Long show this week. Got a hell of a lot of editing to do, so I'm going to jump on that when I can. Probably start that tomorrow, since I'm actually a day ahead of schedule. And then we will reconvene on Monday. And we will have a Retro Raw review this time, I promise. Actually, remember that. It will actually be a Retro Raw that is taped and airs, I think, the following Friday. Because again, it was Labor Day weekend, so they didn't actually have a live show. So, yep. That'll all be for Monday. Cool. I'll wrap it up there. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and take care. Peace out.